So that's 1 Corinthians 6, starting from verse 15. And we're going to read through to chapter 7, verse 9. Don't you know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Don't you know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Don't you know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You're not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Don't deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now, to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Good morning. Welcome. As if to sound like a broken record, another tricky passage in another week from the book of 1 Corinthians. But here we go. It's always great to have your mum in the room when you're talking a lot about sex. So welcome to you, mum. 50 years ago, there was a famous book on the other side of the pond, the people to whom we used to be friends with, apparently. There's a man called Ernest Becker. Ernest Becker wrote a book about the denial of death. The denial of death. He's an anthropologist. That means he looked at society and works out what some of the big themes, what are some of the big things about what we think about. And then the issue was, how has secular society changed in its view of present in light of the future? Present in light of the future. Here he is, Ernest Becker. He says this: we are the first society in the history of the whole world that says there is no ultimate future. Okay? All there is the present. We're the first society on the face of the earth with the widespread belief amongst so many people that when you die, it is game over. There's nothing beyond the grave. When you die, it's the end. Your personal soul, your consciousness is temporary. It's not eternal. That was the tenet of his book. When you die, it's it. Ernest Becker says this: there's never been a society that has had such an understanding of the insignificance of the present, the insignificance of human life. And as a result, there's never been a society that puts so much importance on finding your one true love. If this life is all there is, then you need a life partner. You must find your person, if you watch Grey's Anatomy. You must find the right person with whom you can bear your soul, who you can love. So there's a big emphasis in this worldview, if there's no eternal future, on romance, on love, and on sex. Here's why Becker says we think like that and behave like that. Becker says this: we secular people still need to know that our lives matter. What we used to look for God for, now we look for in our love partner. That's very interesting. What we used to look to God for, a sense of well-being, self, understanding, value, purpose, if God no longer exists, it's not that those things don't matter to us anymore. we have to find a different source to find them from. He says all of us want to be rid of our faults. All of us want to know that we matter. All of us want to have a sense of our enoughness. And so Becca says we live in a society that says without sex, romance, and love, you can't possibly. To 1 Corinthians. Here we have a book written by the Apostle Paul. He was never married. We're not told that he ever had sex with anyone else because he was married not. He was single. And yet he's written this book to the church that was sex obsessed, sex saturated in Corinth. And he says, at the same time, I can hold up this really high view of sex and the goodness of the gift that it is within a complementary and a covenantal marriage. That's the only place that we're to have sex as Christians, says the Apostle Paul. He holds up this high view of sex that God has given. It's not dirty. It's not cheap. It's a precious gift from a good and kind God to be enjoyed within a covenant of marriage between a man and a woman and nowhere else. And at the same time, he exalts singleness and says you do not need sex, you do not need to be married to live a brilliant life. All you need is Jesus. It's fascinating. He's never married himself, and yet he holds up singleness, and he says this in verse 7 of chapter 7, I wish all of you were as I am. I wish all of you lived with an attitude towards the present in light of the future where you are a single person, where you're devoted to Jesus. Sex is a good gift from God, he says, and yet in the same breath he says, you know you can live a perfectly fulfilled, God-centered life without ever having sex with anyone, without ever being married to anyone. Don't you dare look down on singleness, says the Apostle Paul. And he holds both those two truths in tension. This is not something we believe in our society today. Ernest Becker was right in a 50-year-old book. You can live a perfectly fulfilled life, says the Apostle Paul, with God at the center of your heart, with being single for the whole of your life. And that's a great way to live. We live in a very different society to the one that Paul wrote to in Corinth. And yet what he said then is just as radical now. Let's think about that. Here's a radical perspective that Paul wants us to engage with when we think about the relationships. A radical perspective, point number 1. We saw last week, didn't we, at the start of chapter 7:1. Now for the matters you wrote about, that's the letter that he received from the church at Corinth. It's good for a man not to marry. There was a thinking in the church at Corinth, chapter 6, verse 13. Sex is just like an appetite. When you want food, you eat. When you want sex, you sex. It's just an appetite. It's a very low view of sex. And Paul says, no, that's wrong. Sex is a good, God-given gift. It's precious. Here is the second view, chapter 7, verse 1 from our passage. And that was that sex is dirty. Even if you're married, you shouldn't even touch the other person in the marriage relationship because sex is dirty. And Paul says, no. Sex is not just for procreation. Look at what he says in this very sex-positive paragraph, chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. Verse 2, the best defense against sexual immorality, having sex with someone else outside of your covenant relationship if you're married, is to have sex frequently with your husband or your wife. You need to have sex with your spouse frequently, regularly. Notice verse 3, verse 4. Within the covenant relationship, there is a duty to yield to your own desires for the good of the other. Sex is other-centered. Sex is not self-centered, says the Apostle Paul. The only time you should abstain for sex, and be it a very short time, is for prayer, verse 4, and then come quickly back together so that you are not tempted to have sex with someone else. You're not tempted to do things that are impure, that are not God-ordained. Verse 5. It's so practical, the Apostle Paul. And yet remember that he's a single man. He's never been married. And yet he exalts the view of sex to say it's a good gift from God. And God knows that it should be enjoyed and treasured and protected. And only enjoyed and protected within the covenant of a complementary marriage, man and woman. Sex is really a great thing. Verses 1 to 5. And then, completely catching us off guard, notice verse 6. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Without any warning at all, thinking that Paul is going to keep on talking about the positivity of sex in a covenant relationship between two complementary people, he puts sex firmly in its place. It's fascinating. Vaughan Roberts, who's a minister of the gospel up in Oxford, says this. This is a summary of the Bible's attitude towards sex and relationships. He says, God is for sex. Sex is for marriage. Marriage is for life. And all of life is for Christ. All of life is for Christ. Notice what he says. Paul, at the same time, elevates singleness and he relativizes marriage. Don't put all your hopes in marriage, and don't ever look down on people who are single, verse 6, and into the following sentence as well. He repeats the same theme in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 7, and just because of time, he also says the same principle in verses 27 and verse 28 of chapter 7. He says this, to paraphrase, verse 27 and 28. Are you married? Great. Don't try to become single. Are you single? Great. Don't be too eager to get married. Marriage is a lot of trouble in this life. And I want to spare you from that, verse 28. So he's saying if you're married, that's fine. That's a great way to be a Christian. Don't ever look down on people who are single. If you're single, that's fine. It's a great way to be a Christian. Don't look down on people who are married. Here's the main point in summary. Being unmarried is an example for people to imitate. It's not a curse that people need to escape from. And boy, do we need to hear this in the church. In the church, this is a real challenge we need to hear, because I think, having been a Christian for a long time, there has been so many careless words said and pain caused towards single people from the tongues of well-meaning, I hope, married Christian people. A lot of pain has been caused. Andrew Wilson writes a challenging sentence that's on the screen. Inside the church, there is often an obsession with marriage in which having a family is normalized. Married life is idolized, and single people are marginalized. We need to meditate on that. Paul is talking to the church, and he's treading on a tightrope. He's insisting on the goodness of the single life and the core truth that we are not completed only if we get married. We are not sufficient only if we have sex, that the values of the culture and the world come into the church. The only person we need to be completely satisfied is Jesus. And you have no idea how staggering this is. It was shocking in the first century. It should be just as shocking now. It was shocking when Paul wrote for these reasons. We live in a very westernized, individualistic society. To live a fulfilled life, we need to have a good career path, having had a good education, having traveled the world, and having a fulfilled sex life, whatever that means. There's no such thing as individual honor, success, and achievement in the first century in Corinth. It wasn't individual at all. It was all family. Family honor, family success, family achievement. Therefore, you had to be married. Singleness was not an option. If you were single, you had no future, you had no security, no safety net, you had no significance. And then in comes Christianity. And Christianity exalts marriage, but it also exalts singleness. Christianity comes along and it lifts up every single adult and says, this is a perfectly good way to live. The Apostle Paul was single. How about Jesus? He lived a single life and he did okay. It was absolutely unique in the worldview in the around the Mediterranean basin in the first century to say, don't look down on people who are single. Historians tell us this. Christian women, when they became widowed, or men, they were highly respected It was unique. Women in particular enjoyed massive advantages to those around them who were secular and single. The church stood ready to sustain poor widows financially, practically, allowing widows the choice whether they wanted to remarry again or not. That was not the same in secular society. Caesar Augustus decreed that if you lost your husband, you had to get married within 2 years. And if you didn't, you got fined. Because singleness was absolutely illegitimate. So massive pressure on single people, women in particular, to get remarried. There's a financial disincentive to not be in a relationship. And then along comes the church and with the teaching of Jesus Christ, and they honored and promoted and protected single men and women. Read the book of Acts. So on the one hand, what Paul was saying about singleness was amazing then. It was unique. But if we understand it properly, it's also amazing now. Joel, can I help in any way? No. Gremlins. Because if you do know what Paul is saying, it's pretty astounding what he's saying then and now. Paul gives the highest view of sex within a covenant of marriage between two complementary people that anyone has ever heard of, chapter 6. And then he says, chapter 7, you know what, church? It's quite all right to live your whole life without either of them. It's radical. How do we live in this context? Paul says, whatever your relationship context, Paul writes to the church and he reminds them not of the present. He reminds them of the future. And he says, this is how you understand sex, singleness, and marriage. You need to understand your Christian hope. And just like in every chapter in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul orients the church of Corinth from the present, from what's right in front of their noses, to the reality of eternity. He does it with the issue of lawsuits in chapter 6. He does it with the issue of church discipline in 5. He does it with the issue of church division, chapters 1 to 4. And he does it right the way through to the end, to the cherry on top of the whole Corinthian cake, which is the issue of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Remember your Christian hope. How do we do that about our relationship status? Well, that's the remainder of the message. 3 things from this passage about our Christian hope and how we understand sex and its rightful place, singleness, and also marriage. Number 1, remember the ultimate family. Remember the ultimate family. Verse 29 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. What I mean, brothers, is this, that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. He doesn't end the sentence there, which is a good thing. What does he mean? He goes on and he explains it. Paul says, don't look now in the present for your ultimate security, safety, and hope. Don't invest all your resources now. Invest into eternity, into your ultimate hopes. You need to understand your possessions, as good as they are, with open hands. You need to look at your marriage, if you're married, and remember that it's temporary. You need to remember your singleness, that it doesn't mean that you're defective or deficient. It's passing away, this world. Verse 31. The world in its present form is passing away. In other words, Paul, again, like he does in all of his letters, says this. Remember that you're living in the overlap of the ages. For all you mathematicians out there, that means it's a Venn diagram. He says this, Paul understands that Jesus came to earth from heaven once, in flesh, to die for the sins of the world, and he was raised to life again, and he returned to heaven, and he will return for a second time. And so now we're living in the end times, which the Bible explains means from the coming of Jesus, first time, to his return, second time. And so Paul says this, if you have a family, if you have children, you are radically free to not place your identity on those realities. Because of this perspective, look into the future and understand your present now in light of the future. We're part of God's family. We're part of the church. We're part of a new community. And so now we have a foretaste of heaven in the present. It is just a foretaste. But enjoy the security, the identity of the future now. Remember your relationship, identity, and status. The whole issue of sexuality in light of the future. May the future shape your present understanding of everything that you experience. In the future, the Apostle Paul says this, in the future, we will get the only family that our hearts really, really need. We would experience a depth of relationship that sex just points to. It's a shadow of. And if we understand that, we are radically liberated from the constraints and priorities of this world that Ernest Becker, I think, very accurately described. I read this week. Singleness was legitimized in the early Christian church, not because sex was questionable, but because the church lives in the overlap of the ages. Christian singles gave up having heirs, children. In ancient times, there could be nothing more radical than that. This was a clear expression that one's future is not guaranteed by the human family or your children, but by God. What's my security in the present? God is my security in the present. What's my destination in the future? God will be my destination in the future. Why can I live content as a single now? Because I'm trusting in the sufficiency of Jesus Christ that I experience now and will experience fully then. How can I not overburden my marriage so that all my hopes and dreams and security is in the other person? Because I'm trusting in the security of Jesus now and I'll experience fully then. The fact that we have an ultimate family coming means we're totally and radically freed from the cultural weight of expectation that says, you must find your one true love now. We don't, because we have him in part now and we'll have him fully then. Our view of sex, marriage, relationships is revolutionized by the hope of the future ultimate family. Here's the second one, is the ultimate journey. The ultimate journey. Notice Paul says, chapter 6, verse 19, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. We looked at this last week. That reminds us of this classic passage in Ephesians 5 that you hear at many wedding ceremonies. Ephesians 5 says this, listen, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word to present her to himself, a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish. Paul says this, remember, marriage is not just a social duty. It's not even primarily a way for you to find personal significance and happiness. Marriage is a wonderful but very, very, very long and hard journey towards our future glory self. It goes somewhere. There's a purpose and a divine mystery behind the gift of marriage. Every one of us is made by God, and we're a long, long, long way from being what God intends us to be. The means of the wedding day is a delight, but it's a foretaste for the real event, which is the marriage. Get together, have a party with your best friends, celebrate. But the real event is not the wedding day, it's the marriage. Lewis Smedes is an old Christian minister. In his 70s, he said this, my wife has lived with at least 5 different men since we were wed, and each one of them has been me. He talks about the reality of when you're married to someone for a long time, hopefully in God's kindness, the other person changes. That's what should be happening. So if you understand this view of marriage as an ultimate journey, if you were to look for a marriage partner, you do not look for the finished article. You look for a lump of marble. That's why the picture's on the screen. You look for someone with Christian character who you could possibly partner with. When you fall in love with someone, you shouldn't just be falling in love with who they are now. You should be hopeful that each one of you can be used by God to develop the other person into more of a godly character. I'm excited about your future. It's not just the wedding day. I want to be part, through God's indwelling spirit in my life, of making you more like Jesus, and I want you to do the same for me. If you are married, it's simply an invitation to suffer together, as someone has written. I want to journey with you towards the future. It's going to be hard, but God can get us both there. It's a future orientation rather than just a present obsession. That's what Paul is saying the goal of marriage is. It's a long journey, but there is an ultimate purpose that we can easily lose sight of. Finally, quickly, the ultimate lover. The ultimate lover. Look back to chapter 6 where we were last week. And you'll see in 15 to 17 a sandwich of verses that's on the screen. I'll change the microphone again. Look at the bookends, 15 and 17. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Verse 17. He who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. That's talking about union with Christ by faith. Right in the middle. Verse 16. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. What does that mean? In the Gospels, in John's Gospel, John 4, Jesus meets a woman at the well. She's thirsty physically for water. She goes at the high point of the sun and the hottest part of the day to get sustaining water. I have living water, says Jesus to the woman. I have water that if you drink it, you'll never thirst again. She says, we don't know her name, Sir, let me have that water. And then Jesus, as Jesus does so frequently, just turns the conversation on its head and says, well, go and get your husband. I was talking about water and now you want me to go and get my husband. Well, I don't have a husband, she says. No, says Jesus, you've had 5 husbands. And the guy that you're living with right now, well, he's not your husband either. Why, when Jesus meets this woman, looking for physical sustenance through water, does he start talking about living water? Why, when she comes for water, the hottest part of the day, does he turn and focus on her romantic life? I want the water of life, she says. Jesus says, well, let me tell you who you've been sleeping with. How come your life is always centered around men? How come you're looking to men and to sex and relationships to fill a void that only I can fill? Jesus is saying this. You've been looking for the water of life in love. You've been looking for the water of life in romance. And if you do that, you'll always be thirsty. Unless you make me your one true love, you'll always be thirsty. Notice chapter 7. Verse 34 and 35. There's a repeated word in this passage that's very dense but very important about undivided devotion. Paul is saying there are many cares in this world that you have to engage with if you are married. So it's better that you're single, because when you're single, you can have an undevoted devotion to me. And that's a real challenge if you're married. You'll never find what you're looking for if you set all your heart's affections and desires on getting married. Unless you make me your one true love, your whole attitude towards romance and love and perhaps marriage will be utterly distorted. You'll be putting too much weight upon it. Unless you make me your one true love, says Jesus, you're either going to be too desperately looking for romance, you're going to put all your deepest hopes and heart's affections on finding a one true love that you'll crush the other person. You're just putting too many expectations on them. Or you'll stay with the wrong person for too long because the person just serves the end. You want to be in a marriage status. If you don't get married, you can just practically smother the other person under your expectations. And no human being is big enough for that. Jesus says again and again, you need to make me your one true love. If you don't, you're going to make some really bad decisions that you'll regret. You'll hurt yourself, and you can hurt lots of other people as well. Paul is saying the gospel is just so clear that sex and relationships are just a dim shadow, but a meaningful reminder of a certain future. They should prepare us for our ultimate lover. One day, every Christian will fall into the loving arms of Jesus. He's the lover we need. We only have a little bit of that by faith now, but it's real and it's true. And it's a foretaste of seeing Jesus face to face in the future, and what a day that will be. If you have some sense of that in your heart, that liberates you. It frees you from the tyranny of sex and of relationship status. It helps you get those things in the right perspective and proportions in your life. Do you see now, in week 2 of this really important subject, the Christian understanding of sex and relationships is not narrow-minded. God is not a killjoy. If sexuality is a reflection of our relationship with God, think about it in this way. You cannot have intimacy with God without losing your independence. Even God couldn't. Even God couldn't have intimacy with us without losing his independence. How so? On the cross. On the cross, Jesus became human, he became weak, he became vulnerable. And so we can read chapter 6, verse 19. You're not your own. You're bought with a price. Jesus says again and again, make me your one true love. He says it to the woman at the well. Paul says it, repeating the same sentiment, verse 34 and into 35 of chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. Make me your one true love, and everything will be all right. Are you single? Jesus will say to us if we're single, trust me, I'm enough for you. If you're happily married or not so happily married, we still need Jesus as our one true lover. Or you'll become too dependent on the other person you're married to. Jesus says, come to me. What a proposal from our ultimate lover. Let's pray.